Well, Linda and Jay, I have 1 o'clock on my computer here. Are you ready to get started?
Yes, I am.
Looking forward to it, Steve.
Great. Well, thanks for everyone for joining us today. And good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. Great to be here. We're excited to present today's webinar. It's titled, Are You Ready for a Capital Campaign? My name is Stephen Shattuck, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And today I'm joined by 2 leaders in the nonprofit sector. The first is my new friend, Linda Lysakowski. Hey there, Linda.
Hi, how are you?
Thanks for being here. For those of you who don't know Linda, she's one of the foremost authorities on capital campaigns. She's actually one of 100 worldwide who has ever held the distinction of Advanced Certified Fundraising Executive. And she's been in the sector for 20 years. She's served as a philanthropic consultant. She's managed several capital campaigns. She's helped hundreds of nonprofits achieve their development goals. And she's been involved in training. She's trained over 25,000 development professionals in multiple countries and every state of the union here. So it's just a great honor to have her join us. So thanks again, Linda.
Thank you.
And also joining us is my colleague here at Bloomerang, Jay Love. He's the founder and CEO here. Hey there, Jay.
Hi there.
Good for you to be here. Thanks for being here again, as always. Some of you may recognize Jay. He's the original co-founder of eTapestry. He's also currently a senior vice president over at Avectra, in addition to his duties here at Bloomerang. So thanks again for being here, Jay. This should be a really very interesting conversation.
Yes, I'm very much looking forward to it because of the fact that I had the pleasure of presenting in person with Linda just a few weeks ago out in Las Vegas. Everybody's in for a treat today.
Yeah, definitely. So what's going to happen today is Linda's going to get our conversation started. She's going to share her thoughts and her strategies on capital campaigns. And then she's going to hand it off to Jay, who's going to talk about some donor retention strategies after someone has actually committed to supporting that campaign. And what we do at the end of all of our webinars is I'll open it up for questions at the end of Jay's presentation. So if you hear anything or maybe something piques your interest and you'd like to have that explained by either Linda or Jay, please feel free to send those questions over via the chat functionality right there on your webinar screen. And I'll see those questions and I'll field those to Jay and Linda, and we'll try to answer just as many as we can before the 2 o'clock Eastern hour. And I will be sending out the slides following the presentation, as well as a video recording. So if you miss something, don't fret too much. You'll be able to get the resources here later this afternoon. So without any further ado, Linda, why don't you get us started?
Sure, it's great to be here. And as Jay said, we presented together in person a couple of weeks ago, and it's great to be back with Jay, even though we're thousands of miles away this time. He in Indianapolis, I think, and I'm in Boulder City, Nevada. But it's good to be here, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about capital campaigns because it is one of my favorite topics. You know, a lot of people aren't quite sure what a capital campaign even is, so I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a overview of what a capital campaign is. But sometimes our boards or our CEOs may come to us and say, well, let's run a capital campaign. That's a good way to raise a lot of money, but they don't realize what's involved in a capital campaign. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Just on the side of trends that I've been seeing, you know, the last couple of years, especially here in Nevada, our economy was pretty hard hit, and lots of organizations kind of put off capital campaigns because they were waiting for the right time. And sometimes you just can't wait for the right time. Sometimes there seems like there is never going to be a right time to do this, but it has to be done. So it's when you have a need and a case that's really strong, that's the time to do a capital campaign. What I think is exciting about capital campaigns is that not only does running a campaign allow you to build a building or raise the money for whatever project you're doing, but it also helps strengthen your organization as you go forward. And what I've seen in almost every single case is once you run a successful capital campaign, your annual giving program becomes much stronger going forward. It lays the seed for major gifts and planned gifts. So a capital campaign has a lot of side benefits in addition to the ultimate and immediate goal of raising money for your capital campaign. But a simple definition of what a capital campaign is that it's typically a very significant fundraising effort for major institutional needs, be they buildings, endowment, or program. Now, when I say significant, that could be different for every one of you. We may have some people on the line who are considering campaigns in the millions or even billions. Certainly many of the universities are running multi-billion-dollar campaigns. Or for your organization, maybe a significant fundraising effort is $1 million or $500,000. It depends a lot on what your organization's needs are. But typically when we talk about a capital campaign, we're usually talking about a building or some type of a capital need. In the case of a hospital, it could be a major piece of equipment that costs millions of dollars. But for most agencies, it might be that you need to build a new building, you need to renovate an existing building, you need to move into another building and renovate it, some combination of those things. For many organizations, they also need to build their endowment funds. And so lots of times an organization will run an endowment campaign, which is very similar to a capital campaign in that you're trying to raise a large amount of money in a given amount of time. But that money, instead of being used to fund capital needs, will go into an endowment to fund future program needs. And sometimes an organization does all three. They're trying to raise money for a building, endowment, and maybe their ongoing program at the same time. We typically call that a comprehensive campaign. And in most cases, even if you think your only immediate needs are a building, in most cases, you're really wise to also at the same time raise some money for endowment and program, because typically if you're going to be building a new building, it's because you have more need for, guess what, programs. You have, maybe you need a larger facility, maybe you need to move into a different community because there's another population that's not being served in your community. But in almost every case, moving to a new building means you're going to have probably a need for program. You might need to hire additional staff. You might need more equipment. You might be expanding your hours. So in almost every case, you're going to need more money to operate that building. And so you have to think ahead and say, are we going to be able to operate this once it's up and running? And I've seen some organizations run campaigns that didn't plan ahead, and lo and behold, they built a great new building, but they didn't have money to operate their programs. So you really need to think about this and decide up front, are you going to be raising money for just building, or do you want to also at the same time raise money for endowments and programs? Right now I'm working with a client who is raising money to build a new facility, but in the meantime, they also have to operate their current facility. They're going to have two facilities when they're finished. So they're raising money not only for the building needs, but also to operate the program in both facilities for the first year. So that's, I think, a really wise decision, and I congratulate the board for having the foresight to do that. So now that you kind of understand what a capital campaign is, what's involved in it. Sometimes people shy away from campaigns because they hear that it's a lot of work, and actually there's a lot of emphasis on the pain part of capital campaign. So what I'm trying to do is get rid of some of that pain for you and have you just kind of take it piece by piece. And when you break it down and really take it in manageable sized chunks, I think any organization can successfully run a capital campaign. So typically what's involved is research, some sound research. First of all, you need to research the need in your community. Does your community need this building? Does it need newer programs? Do you need a larger, not so much what you need, but what your community needs? And that's, I think, really important. So you want to have a long-range strategic plan for your organization overall so that you know where your organization is going and what your community needs are. Usually a capital campaign also involves some persuasive campaign literature, but I always like to caution people, don't spend so much time thinking about how you're going to present this campaign to the public. I've seen a lot of organizations that spend hours and hours and dollars and hire marketing companies to help them put together great-looking, fancy brochures and a brand-new website, but they don't spend any time identifying, cultivating, and soliciting donors. And the campaign literature is going to help your campaign, but it's not going to make you succeed. So don't spend too much time and money on campaign literature and neglect the other things that are important, such as an effective organization. You need to have a campaign plan, an organizational structure that shows how this money is going to be raised, who's going to be involved in helping you raise it, what's the budget for the campaign. So I want to talk about a few of those things in the short amount of time that we have here. The application of proven procedures. You know, every organization says to me when I first go talk to them, well, you know, we're different. We're very different. We can't run a traditional capital campaign. And I always tell them, yes, I understand you're different and you're unique, and every organization has its own unique qualities, but there are certain proven procedures that always work in a capital campaign, no matter who your organization is, no matter how much money you're trying to raise or what the purpose is. And some of those proven procedures are that a campaign is always successful when it's worked from the top down and the inside out. And what I mean by that is working from the top down means that you have to look for those leadership gifts first. The small gifts will come at the end. They're easy to raise, but you've got to focus your energy on getting the leadership gifts first. And working from the inside out means that you, the family of your organization, and go first to your board, your staff, your campaign cabinet, your volunteers, the people that are really close to your organization. And you raise the money first from the family of your organization, and then you go out to the community. And it also involves careful scheduling and publicity. One of the things that you don't want to do is announce your campaign prematurely. Sometimes I've seen an organization that is so eager to get their campaign going, they say, well, once people know about this, they're all going to give us money. And so they announce the campaign when they've only raised a very small portion of the funds. And you want to be able to have probably somewhere between 70 and 80% of your money raised before you kick this off publicly. The thing that makes a capital campaign different about any other fundraising that you do, like your annual campaign, your grant writing, your events, those are things that you do year after year. A capital campaign runs within a specified time period. And that's one of the most important things about your campaign planning is how long is this campaign going to run? Because if you have a campaign that runs for 10 years, people are going to get real tired of it, I can tell you that. If you have a campaign that doesn't have enough time, you won't have the sufficient time to do all the cultivation and identification that you need to do. So you really need to look at the specific time period. In most cases, unless it's a very large campaign, most campaigns maybe run 18 months to 2 years, maybe 3 years. Sometimes with a very large multi-billion-dollar campaign, you might go for a longer time period. But you need to look at what's appropriate for your organization. And you also need to have a budget for this campaign. Now, some organizations are very fortunate in that they've budgeted sufficient money in their operating costs that they can put the campaign costs into their operating budget. But for many organizations, probably most organizations, wrap their campaign costs into the overall goal of their campaign. So it is important to realize that this is going to cost you some money going into it, and I think it's real important to think about that. So what are some of the typical things that you need to have in place? Well, first of all, you really need to have a solid foundation for this campaign. You need to have an infrastructure in place, such as ethical standards. You obviously need to have good donor software, and I'm not going to spend much time on that because Jay's going to talk to you about how that works.
We appreciate the mention of Linda. Thank you.
Well, it's really critical, and I can't tell you how critical it is. I just think when I see organizations trying to do a campaign without having the proper tools to manage it, they're never successful with it. So that's a real important piece of your infrastructure. Annual giving history is important, although I must say that I have run campaigns for organizations that have never raised a dime before they did this capital campaign, but it's because they've had some of the other pillars of success in place that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But if you have an annual giving history, you're way much ahead of the game because you have already identified donors, you have some methods, you probably have the donor software and some of these other things in place. You do need to have gift acceptance policies, and sometimes even if you do have an annual giving program in place, you might not have thought about things like what kind of gifts do we want to accept and from who do we want to accept gifts and what do we do with those gifts and how do we recognize those gifts. All of those things need to be in written policies. And one of the reasons it's especially important, you really need to have that in place for any fundraising, but it's especially important in a capital campaign because you're probably going to be involving a lot of volunteers, and you don't ever want a volunteer to go out and contact someone and receive a gift and come back to you all excited because they got a gift and you say, oh, we can't take that gift. And I've had people in capital campaigns that, just for some examples, one client of mine was offered a gift of land, and this client was in Las Vegas when land was selling about $1.5 million an acre. Now you can probably buy it for about $10 an acre, but at that time land was very expensive. And they were all excited about this gift of land until they found out it needed to have soil remediation. It was going to cost them $500,000. So needless to say, that gift of land had to be turned down. I've had clients that were offered gifts from companies or individuals that they didn't want to accept the gift from for one reason or another. So all of those things are going to be important in your gift acceptance policies. You definitely need to have staff support. It's very, very challenging to run a campaign without adequate staff support. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then in most states in the United States, and I'm not sure if we have any Canadians on board here or any other countries, but in the United States, almost every state requires you to be registered to do fundraising. So if this is a whole new venture for you and you're not registered, or you're maybe raising money in states where you're required to be registered, so that's something that you need to look into. So those are all things that I consider part of the infrastructure. And as important as they are, there's a couple items that I think are really critical, and they're what I call the pillars of success. And without these, you absolutely cannot run a capital campaign. You can buy donor software. You can develop gift acceptance policies. You can make sure you're registered. Those things are fairly easy to do. But these are the essential ingredients of a successful campaign, and one of them is that your board is fully committed to this. And when I say committed, I mean financially, emotionally, spiritually, in every way. They have to be committed to make this campaign successful. You need to have a compelling case for support. And I could talk for hours just about developing your case for support, but I'll leave it with the fact that a case for support to be compelling needs to have both an emotional and a rational appeal. The emotion is usually what draws people in. If you're raising money to build a kennel for little puppies, that's a real emotional draw. If you're raising money for kids, that's a really emotional draw. But even if you're, let's say you're a university and you might not think so much of emotion, but you're drawing on the alumni emotion, the attachment that they have for your school. So every organization has some way to emotionally appeal to its donors. But before somebody gets out the checkbook and writes the check, the emotion only goes so far. You also have to have a rational appeal that says, yes, we believe we can raise this money, and here's why we believe we can raise the money. We believe we can deliver these programs, and here's why we believe. We're financially stable, and here's the proof of that. Our board is committed to this. People ask those rational questions. They think with both their left brain and their right brain when they're making a gift. So you have to be able to appeal to both of them. And the key to a compelling case is that it appeals to both the emotion and the rational side. Now, you obviously need prospective donors if you're going to raise money in a campaign. So if you already have that annual giving history, you probably have a pool of donors. If not, your campaign might take a little bit longer because you're going to need to identify and perhaps cultivate those prospective donors. You also need to have effective volunteer leadership for the campaign. And to me, this is probably the most critical aspect of a successful campaign. I've run campaigns, as I said, for organizations that have never raised a dime, had absolutely no infrastructure in place until we started working on their campaign. But they were successful because they had some key community volunteers who said, I believe in this organization and I believe in this campaign, and I'm going to step up and chair the campaign or work on the campaign cabinet. And that effective volunteer leadership, to me, is one of the most critical parts of your campaign. Now, there was a little handout that I believe Stephen put up on the chat box. If you haven't had a chance to download this, I'll just briefly mention it here. But I would urge you to download this, and it might be a form that you might want to take to your next board meeting or your next campaign cabinet meeting if you're that far along in your campaign that you already have a cabinet in place. But this is a simple quiz that's a one-page, 20 questions of, are you ready for a capital campaign? And of course, there's a lot more that goes into it. But I think this questionnaire will give you a good feel for how prepared your organization is to do a campaign. So let's say, you have the infrastructure in place, but maybe your board's not willing, or maybe you have the board willing and raring to go, but maybe you don't have all the pieces in place that you need to do. So these 20 questions are all ranked from 0 to 5. And after you complete this questionnaire, if you rank about 85 to 100, you're probably ready to launch a campaign immediately. If you're somewhere between 70 and 84, you're probably going to need to make some improvements. If you're somewhere between 55 and 69, there's probably going to be some extensive preparation needed. And if you're 0 to 54, your agency probably needs some serious reorganization before you can even think about a capital campaign. So I'm urging you to kind of take that brief quiz. I'm going to talk a little bit later about my book called Are You Ready for a Capital Campaign that will give you an even more detailed way to assess your readiness for a campaign. But I want to kind of go on so we have plenty of time for Jay to talk about how to use your software. But these are from my perception, and Jay can certainly add to this, the reasons I think it's important to have a software system for a capital campaign. First of all, you really want to code, you're going to have different divisions in this capital campaign. For example, there's probably going to be a group of people who are contacting the board. Maybe, depending on the size of your staff, maybe it's a whole group of people contacting the staff members to ask for their gifts. You might have a group that's going to volunteers. If you're an alumni group, and we all basically have alumni of some way, shape, or form. I did a campaign once for a dog rescue group, and our alumni were people who adopted a dog in a certain year, and they were called by other people who adopted a dog in that same year and asked to support the campaign. So you don't have to be a university or a school to have alumni. Most of us have some form of alumni. You'll always want to have a leadership gift division that's looking at the major gifts. You might have regional divisions, depending if you're a national or regional organization. You might have a small business division. I'm working with a health-related group, so they have a division that's talking to professionals, doctors and dentists and groups like that. So you want to be able to code all those divisions so you can track each division's goal, because each division is going to have a dollar goal that they're trying to raise. You also want to be able to code in your database your solicitors, because you want to know which solicitors are completing their calls on time, which ones might need a little help, maybe need some extra training, which ones are doing a really great job, and maybe they could help some of the others who aren't doing such a good job. You obviously need to be able to do things like mail merges, so you can send out personalized appeals. And I am a firm believer that in any kind of fundraising, there's absolutely no reason on earth anymore to send out a dear friend letter with a label slapped on the outside. You really need to make this a personal approach. You obviously need to send out pledge reminders and acknowledgments. And if you've never done a capital campaign, this may be the first time you've ever actually had to track pledges, because maybe all your gifts are things that come in. You get a grant and it's recorded. You got this grant. You get a check in the mail. You get, something that comes in to you, a gift of stock, a gift of cash, a gift in kind. Maybe you've never had to record multi-year pledges, and that's going to be really critical. I can't tell you how many campaigns I've seen suffer because they don't track their pledges. And I remember once making a gift to a campaign, and this group apparently didn't have a good donor system in place because they never reminded me of my pledge payment. So guess what? I never finished paying the pledge because I didn't know how much I owed them, and I didn't think it was my responsibility to call them. So those things are really important that you have that in place. You also are going to be able to have to do reports from your donor system so that your board, your campaign cabinet, maybe your bank, if you're going to be going for a construction loan, will want to see those reports. So those things are critical. I want to just flip back a minute to gift acceptance policies, and I've pretty much talked about that, but I think it's important that you do have these written policies in place about what type of gifts you're going to accept. How are you going to dispose of those gifts? If you're a local art museum and someone wants to give you a Picasso painting, that's probably wonderful, if it fits your collection, that is. But if you're the local homeless shelter, what are you going to do with a gift of a Picasso painting? You might have to have a policy that we're going to have this phrase, we're going to sell it at an auction, we're going to, whatever we're going to do with it. And how you're going to manage your investment portfolio. All of those things are going to be important. And as well, in capital campaigns, you also need to have recognition policies in place. So if you're running a $10 million campaign, you're probably not going to name the building after somebody who gives you a $50,000 gift, but you might want to name it after someone who gives you an $8 million or $5 million gift. So those things you really need to have written down before you get started. I want to kind of talk a little bit about board responsibilities. I mentioned that it's really important for the board to be fully committed to this campaign, and it's great if you have some board members with the capability, the affluence part of it, that can give at a meaningful level and will have access to other potential donors. But every board member, no matter what their capability is, should be able to promote your organization and your campaign into the community. And every board member has a sphere of influence. So don't think because you don't have a strong board that you can't run a successful capital campaign, because you can. I've seen it happen time after time. But it's just that every board member needs to really make that commitment. And you also should have some board members willing to serve on campaign leadership roles, because they're going to be important as well. I know we're getting a lot of questions in, and we are going to address those at the end, and I'll take a look at all those, but I want to get through this material quickly so we can move on and have Jay talk to you more about the software. I do want to mention the campaign staff functions during the capital campaign, though, because there's a lot of work involved in a capital campaign. I won't deny that. And sometimes organizations have their staff pulled in so many different directions. I've worked with organizations that are running 14 special events a year, and I've told them they're crazy for doing it. But sometimes staff gets pulled between writing grants and running events, and how are we going to have time to run a capital campaign? So you need to think about this going into it and decide, do you need to hire extra staff? Are some of these things that a consultant can do for you? How are you going to handle the staff functions, such as coordinating all the meetings and events? Because this is going to be a lot of volunteer-driven. You're going to need support for those volunteers. You're going to need somebody that can prepare those reports for the board and the CEO and the cabinet. You're going to need people to handle internal communications with the rest of the staff, external communications, newsletters, websites, all of those kind of things, press releases, and then just the day-to-day clerical type support. So you need to think about going into this whether your staff has the time and the expertise to do all of this. I want to spend a few minutes talking about campaign volunteers, because this is, as I said, the most important critical thing to me, and I've kind of outlined already who is typically on a campaign cabinet. Usually are the chairs of different committees, like your different divisions, and the divisions are all people who are involved in actually soliciting gifts, leadership, small business, major gifts, whatever categories you might have. But there are also some people that you'll have on your committees that maybe aren't necessarily involved so much in direct solicitation, but they're people who help you plan events such as the kickoff and the dedication and recognition event. A capital campaign usually doesn't raise money through events, but there are some events that help publicize the campaign, and those things need to have someone in charge of them. So if you can get volunteers to do those kind of things, that's helpful. A public relations committee to handle some of the publicity aspects. A finance committee. Now, you might have a finance committee on your board that's going to handle this, and you might not need it on your campaign cabinet. Every campaign is structured slightly different. Obviously, if you're running an endowment campaign, you don't need a building committee, or if you have a facilities department within your organization, you might not need one either. But those are typically some of the volunteers that are involved. And I'm going to wrap up just briefly talking to you about the benefits of doing a planning study. Most capital campaigns, before they're ready to be launched, really benefit by doing a planning study, or some people call it a feasibility study, for several reasons. It helps you kind of pre-sell the campaign and attract key leadership. People love giving advice. You know the old saying, if you ask for money, you get advice, and if you ask for advice, you get money. Well, that's kind of what the planning study does. It's where you engage a consultant to go out and interview people in your community, whatever your community is, whether it's national, regional, or local, and find out whether your case is strong. Do you have a compelling case for support? And do people really going to get behind this? We're asking people during this study whether they would, first of all, give to this, whether they would get involved as a volunteer, whether they know other folks who we should be talking to. So the planning study, to me, in almost every case, can really benefit your campaign. Now, I've run some campaigns without the benefit of a planning study, but usually only when there's a very compelling reason. I once did a $7 million capital campaign, and we had 3 people who were chairing it, and they had all agreed to give at least $1 million before we started. So we had half the money in our pocket before we even started recruiting people to serve on the campaign cabinet. So sometimes you don't need it, but for most organizations, the planning study is really another essential component. So I'm going to turn it over to Jay, and in the meantime, I'll look through the questions that people have so far for me, so when we get to Q&A, I'll be ready to answer them. So well, Jay, it's all yours.
Thank you, Linda. We'll get to those questions with no problem at all. And when you talk about a capital campaign, the tools that really help, and Linda alluded to this a little bit earlier, the effective use of a donor database really makes the campaign goal achievable, because it's going to give you your game plan or your project map that will take you to that ultimate goal. And when I talk about an effective use of a donor database, what I'm really referring to there is simply everyone using it daily to build relationships. We so often think about donor databases as being just these record-keeping tools, but in this day and age, particularly with some of the larger campaigns that people are involved in, it really has to be more of what we refer to as a constituent relationship management, or a CRM, where it will manage and let you track all the communications that's going on between your constituents and yourself and your staff and your volunteers, and what has happened in each of those relationship building steps that come into play. And I think the best way for me to share that is to share a little story of myself here, because I have been involved in many campaigns from the technology standpoint. I've also been involved on many boards that were in campaigns. But I had the opportunity about 4 years ago to chair a capital campaign with my wife. And this was quite the learning experience because it was building a new facility for the one of the branches of the Indianapolis YMCA. And little did I know that this $4 million campaign was going to be such a heavy lift because, as I researched a little bit, I still took it on because I thought this is going to be a perfect case study for me to talk about later, and it really did truly end up being that. They had no prior records of the people that had donated to actually build the building when it was first created about 10 years earlier. And so that pointed out that we were going out after first gifts rather than taking people that had a tradition of giving and upgrading those folks and moving them up into higher levels in one way or another. To do that, it also meant that we did not have any record of the communications and how the relationship had been built. And so the key thing we did not know who the connectors were. Who were the human beings that had brought them in to begin with, who had been communicating with them and all. And Linda, I got to tell you, your slides are right on. If it had not been for the volunteers that stepped up, this campaign goal would have never been reached because we did not have all of the appropriate tools to make it come to life. But the volunteers, and I'll have to congratulate my wife very strongly on this too, they literally by brute force and effort made this come to life and made this happen for us, and it was a really good ending to the story, but it was not without its hardships along the way. So let's talk a little bit further about these capital campaign tools, and I mentioned something that everybody can use, and the keys to that is it has to be something so intuitive that if your volunteers are involved, or even more so your executives are involved, or maybe members of your board, they're not going to go through days and days of training to make something like that come to life. If it's not where they can just sit down and start using it and using it on different types of devices, that's not going to happen. And you also need a tool that helps bring best practices to life so you can see what would be the appropriate steps in building a relationship and what are some of the ways that as far as communicating with people and doing it like Linda alluded to, making sure that everything is personalized to the nth degree, and truly that once it's in place that it's a tool that all of the executives and fundraisers felt like they could not live without. They really could not do their day-to-day job without that tool in place. And once that tool's in place, I really believe the linchpin is the engagement. And those of you that are not old enough to realize what a linchpin is, it's used figuratively to mean something or someone that holds the various elements of a complicated structure together. And I really think as you're talking about talking to people about capital campaign gifts and major gifts in general, that the amount of engagement that you have with those people is the linchpin, because without high levels of engagement, you are not going to reach success in those areas. And engagement tracking is knowing the level and progression of engagement for any prospect relationship is key. One of the questions I suppose pose in sort of a rhetorical manner is, how do you go about doing that? And I ask that question a lot myself to people like Linda, and truly involve two very well-known experts in that arena. Dr. Adrian Sargent is our chief scientist here at Bloomerang, and talking about what we do as far as donor engagement and donor loyalty and getting people in the proper perspective for making a capital campaign or a major gift come to life. And then more importantly, having them stay in the fold and being retained by your organization year after year for that. And then on the communication side, taking what Linda was talking about and moving it up to the highest levels is Mr. Tom Ahern. We work very closely with him and talking about what type of, for instance, what reading level should it be? And Stephen, if we don't get very many questions at the end, store that one back, and we'll talk a little bit about what reading level your communication should be at in your letters and your acknowledgments and your thank yous and your emails, what they should be and how they should be positioned, because Tom's got some wonderful theories that we've built into the application in order to help you check those to make sure you're bringing them to life. But let's drop back into engagement here and talk a little bit about how do we measure engagement? How do we know when someone has become more engaged and a relationship is being built with them within our organization and within all of our staff and our board for them? Now, you could certainly point, as you see at the top here with some of the ones that we have here, their recency and pattern of giving and whether or not they're giving outright or doing things in the way of pledges or recurring transactions. But we also think it's very important to see how many years in a row someone's been, or how many years out of the last 5, or how many years out of the last 10. Those are particular guideposts toward levels of engagement, whether or not they're upgrading or downgrading. Obviously, if they lapse totally, then that's going to move their engagement way down. But there's some factors that we can also track that are really good indicators. Think about whether or not people attend your events or whether they volunteer in some form or another. Those are strong indicators of engagement. Some of the best capital campaign gifts and legacy gifts have come from people that have been lifelong volunteers to organizations that no one even realized they had the capacity to make that type of gift. And then on a communication side, being able to track whether or not someone is even opening any email that you send to them, or whether they're clicking on the email or forwarding it to other people or unsubscribing, those factors all come into play to know whether or not they are engaged with our organization. And then this is one I just think is marvelous here, and I'll put my little star there for it. The inbound interactions. Anybody that comes to you, that comes to your facility and would like to take a tour, or places a phone call, or sends an email unsolicited to you, those are people that are searching out and wanting to find out more about your organization or have a question answered. Those are golden opportunities for building the relationships to the higher levels where this engagement can really happen. We would define soft credits as stewardship, and this is a real critical one too. I'll put a big arrow there for it. What we're talking about are people that bring in matching gift employers, bring in funds from family foundations or other foundations because of relationships there, or if they're participating in an event with you, you get a good indication of their level of engagement because they're getting sponsors for themselves or sponsors for your event. And all of those were people that are making an outright donation, but it's because of their help and their guidance in making it happen, so they're getting the soft credit for that. And then obviously social media. Just starting to see that come into play, but people that like you on Facebook, that say something about you on Twitter or LinkedIn and etc., that can be meaningful in saying they have got some sort of a relationship with you. And we make those all come to life. I wanted to just show a couple quick screens here in the Bloomerang package here, but we make that come to life here. You can see here that this particular person has an engagement level. This is a foundation that's at the cool level, but here's an individual that's moved to a warm. And then as we see these factors coming into play in all of our different activities, we can actually see people move into the higher level of hot or on fire. And this is somebody, as you can see from their giving here, we've got a nice change here, and their involvement with our organization is just moving upwards in many different ways. And if you looked at Mr. Signorelli's record here, we can take a look at that more in sort of a timeline view like you would see on Facebook, and we can see that there's a lot of involvement year after year and a lot of different activities happening. And we highlight over in this square right here that I'm circling right now, the ability to see what are the most significant factors that move that engagement needle back and forth, so we can see in a particular year these two factors are what move this engagement needle to this higher level. So that makes it very straightforward, and it's doing this automatically in the background. As people do their day-to-day work with the system, it's moving these meters up or down. And that's the beautiful part of having a system that everybody uses, not just a database administrator or a designated operator. It can make such a difference for that and really make that come to life in a much, much greater way because of that. Now, Linda alluded to some different reports that come into play, and one of the ones that I think is very important is what we call the engagement level report, being able to see what level of engagement that they are. We can see that's in this column here when I bring the actual report up here. So we've got the engagement level, and then our last couple of meetings or transactions with them, their lifetime giving, and their most recent transaction. I would have begged, borrowed, and stole to have that in place as I was chairing this capital campaign and be able to look through and find out how many different types of meetings have been had with this person in the past, what type of relationship's been built, and more importantly, what tradition of giving that they've made to your organization, because those people, even at the smallest level that have had a tradition of giving, will many times rise to the occasion for the calling of the case statement for a capital campaign. It can make all the difference in the world. So we roll all this up, and the last screen I wanted to show you in the application is what we call the donor retention screen, so that we can see after people have been givers to your organization, how many of those you retain from one year to the next. And one of the beautiful parts of a capital campaign is sometimes the outreach into the community, bring in new individuals. It can be a very good acquisition if it's parlayed in the press and different type of communications are done properly. You can bring a lot of individuals to the fold, and one of the critical factors to the success of the organization long term is keeping those people in the fold from one year to the next. And I'm sure Linda's got a comment or two on that she'll make here in just a minute, because we've both talked about that in one time or another. So we try to bring all these together in the Bloomerang database so that it's the next generation that combines both database and record-keeping functions with CRM functions, easy enough for everybody to use, and brings campaign best practices to life. So what I wanted to do right now, we've got about 15 minutes left, Steve. Can we open it up for some questions for Linda and myself and see where we want to go?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a few here in the chat room, so we can jump right into it. We've got a question from Skip, and maybe Linda can speak to this since it concerns capital campaigns specifically. Skip was wondering, what's an appropriate percentage of annual revenue for marketing, fundraising, and comprehensive campaigns? So I think Skip's wondering kind of how you would delegate funds between everything else and the capital campaign. What do you think about that, Linda?
Okay, that's a great question, and unfortunately I think it's a hard one to answer. The cost of fundraising has always been a real dilemma, because there are some kind of watchdogs and guide dog organizations that say, for example, I believe the Better Business Bureau says your fundraising cost shouldn't be more than 35% of your revenue. But it's hard to put a dollar figure or even a percentage figure to what cost should be, because it depends so much on the organization. For example, if you're a university that has a built-in alumni base, you've been raising money probably for 100 years or 50 years, you don't have to really go out and find new donors. Your percentages to raise money are probably going to be a lot lower than an organization that does not have an alumni base to draw from. Let's say you're the local food pantry. You probably aren't going to be raising a ton of money from the people who use your services. So your costs are going to be a little bit higher, because you've got to spend money identifying donors and starting from scratch. And maybe you need to make that first initial investment in software and website design and things like that. So it's kind of hard. One thing that I can say is it's been a proven fact that organizations who invest more into fundraising raise a lot more. A couple of years ago, the California Community College Foundation did a study, and it's probably available on their website. And I don't remember the exact dollars, but I'm going to guess at it, and it was close to this. They found that colleges that had 2 or fewer employees in their development office were raising something like $2 million a year per employee. But when they had 7 or more employees in development, they were raising $3 to $4 million per employee. So obviously, the more you invest in development, the more you're going to raise. On the capital campaign side, many consultants will tell you that your campaign budget should be somewhere between 10 and 15% of your campaign goal. I've found that in my experience that a lot of times if it's a smaller, locally based campaign, usually those costs are closer to 8 to 10%, and sometimes even less than that. So I guess the answer really is it depends. I know that doesn't probably help a lot, and I'm going to give you my email address before we finish this. So if anyone wants to email me directly and just give me a little more facts about their individual case, I can probably give you a better answer on that.
Okay, great. Linda, one thing that really stuck out to me in your slides was the importance of a volunteer in the capital campaign, a good volunteer who really can own things.
I will second that. I will second that motion, Stephen.
I'm sure, Jay, you've experienced that firsthand as well. So the question is, how do you energize that person? How do you ask them to be involved, and how do you ask them to really take the reins on that?
I think that's a really good question, and the way I think is the best way to energize volunteers is, first of all, make sure that they have all the facts. Make sure you have a compelling case. Make sure that they get accurate reports of what's going on. The worst thing you can do to a volunteer is send them out to see someone, not give them that donor history that Jay was just showing. I love that chart that says whether a donor is on fire, hot, cold. I think that is the greatest tool I've ever seen in a software package. And that to me is, if I was a volunteer and I get somebody who's on fire, I'd be pretty excited about that. If I got somebody who was a little cold, I'd have to think about, oh, what do I say to this person? The other thing I think is really important is volunteer training is essential. And if you're running this campaign by yourself without a consultant, you might consider just bringing in a consultant to do volunteer training. If you have a consultant engaged to help you with the campaign, that will probably be part of the services that they would provide for you, because most volunteers feel like they just need their confidence built a little bit, and if you can provide the training and all the tools they need, they're going to feel like they're ready to do this.
What do you think of that, Jay? Maybe was there a volunteer on that YMCA capital campaign that maybe stuck out in your mind, and how did you energize those folks?
Oh, there were multiple ones that did that. First of all, they were people that were early donors to the campaign themselves, so you knew they believed in that for it. And then they were just the type of people, when they saw that there was going to have to be further digging and additional work, they just rolled up their sleeves and said, we're going to make it happen. They were not going to see that it be unsuccessful in any way, shape, or form. And every organization, that's the backbone of that, and they were priceless. You couldn't have paid them enough to do what they were doing.
Great. We've got an interesting question from Kathleen. She was wondering what percentage of the campaign goal should be generated from board gifts. What do you think about that, Linda?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but that's another one where I think the answer is it depends. Some consultants will tell you that the board should give 1/3 of the goal. I can tell you that I've probably never worked with a campaign where, well, maybe one, the one where we had those 3 donors who were all committed to at least $1 million to start with. But in most cases, it depends on the size of your board, on the capability of your board, on the size of the campaign. So again, I think it really has to be an individual thing. What I would do is really make sure that you do a serious evaluation of your board, ask them to make a stretch gift, and the most important part about board giving, whether it's annual capital plan giving, whatever, the most important part about board giving is that you have 100% commitment. I would never, ever in the capital campaign go out to anybody in the public and ask for a gift until we had 100% giving from the board, and that it's at a meaningful level. And a meaningful level could be very different. I once worked on a campaign where one of the board members, it was a small campaign, it was less than $1 million, but one of the board members made a $25 gift, and I thought surely I must have missed a few zeros when I saw the pledge card, I said to the board chair, do you think this is correct? Should we call her? And he said, no, trust me right now, that's a meaningful gift for her. And he said, I don't want to say anything more about it. But, so other board members were giving $50,000 and some were giving $25,000. But the point was we had 100% participation, and every board member gave at what was meaningful for them. So I think that's the two critical things. So look at your board, and based on their annual giving and their capability and the research that you do, find out what is a reasonable stretch gift, and remember that they can make it over usually it's a 3-year pledge period, sometimes even longer. But focus on the 100% and the meaningful level more than the dollar amount.
And I'll add to
you
that.
served on boards, yeah. What do you think about that, Jay?
I'll add to that. I think where a good record-keeping tool comes into play, and I'm sure that surprises everybody listening that I would say that, but it's not so much the board gift from themselves per se, but what they're responsible for and what their connections have led through. And I've usually seen that has been somewhere between 1/3 and 50%, that their direct connections or their tertiary connections, second and third connections, together come in to create 50% of the goal of the campaign. And what was interesting, before we did this YMCA campaign, we did the employee and staff campaign, and I had one of the employees come in that was a lower level employee that pledged the equivalent of their entire year's salary to this campaign.
Wow.
And that person told why to the board. Needless to say, we had 100% participation at some pretty significant levels after that presentation.
Wow.
It's funny you said that, because I had a client once that did the same thing. It was a human service agency, and it wasn't one particular client, but we did the board appeal and staff appeal pretty much simultaneously. And when the staff report came in and they showed how much they were raising from basically social workers, several of the board members said, I think I need to up my pledge. This is embarrassing.
It certainly is. And no one meant it to be embarrassing.
No.
It just really appealed to a different part of everyone's heart and soul on making that happen for that. So it's, there's no tried and set rule, but I think those two factors really come into play in making sure that the board is involved with making those connections happen, because as you can imagine, in this campaign I was referring to, with no prior records, those connections were our lifeblood.
Definitely. Well, we've got time for probably one more question before we wrap things up. We want to be cognizant of people's schedules here as we go on into the afternoon. There's one question here from Jean. She asks, how would a $500,000 campaign be treated differently than maybe a larger goal? So Linda, you kind of touched on levels of capital campaigns and sort of the goals of those. What do you think of how you would approach it based on the actual dollar amount goal?
Actually, the way I would approach it is not much differently than I would a $500 million campaign, because the same structure is going to work, working from the top down, from the inside out. The only difference is that usually a $500,000 campaign can probably complete it, I'm saying, not necessarily, but really complete it in a shorter time period, because you're not after the really, really big gifts, and your scale of gifts will reflect. Maybe a lead gift for a $500,000 campaign might be $50,000 to $100,000, as opposed to a campaign with a much larger goal having a lead gift of $1 million or more. So actually, the same principles pretty much hold true in a small campaign.
What do you think of that, Jay? Would you approach things differently based on the actual goal amount?
Yeah. In fact, for something of that nature, you may not even have to make it a public campaign. It could be for a very special purpose, and see if this capital campaign could be answered for that by a smaller group of individuals, and maybe save all of the extra effort and the PR work and all for a larger campaign that you could do maybe in a shorter time period, maybe just a couple, 3 years down the road after this one was completed for it, because this might be the foundation. That might be the organization's very first building or their very first service center or something of that nature, and then you can build upon that a little bit later with a public campaign.
Great, great. Well, we are just about out of time, and I want to give Linda a few moments here. I know she has a special offer for folks who tuned in today. So, Linda, what do you got for folks here?
I do. I have actually 2 books out. One is Capital Campaigns, Everything You Need to Know, which is a regular book. And then I have the accompanying workbook that goes with that, Are You Ready for a Capital Campaign? And I'm offering a 10% discount. So if anyone is interested, you can just email me, and I will make sure that you get the code to get that 10%. And my email address is just linda@lysakowski.com, but there's some other ways that you can also get in touch with me. So that's the offer that I'd like to make, and I certainly want to wish everyone much success with their campaigns. And it's been a real pleasure to be here with Jay again. Yeah,
it was great to have you. And Jay, I want to give you a little bit of time. I know there were some Bloomerang-centric questions there in the chat room. How can folks find out more about what we've got going on?
Well, obviously, just go right to the Bloomerang website, the bloomerang.co. Thanks to Steve and in all of his wonderful efforts, there's several outstanding pieces of information there that you can peruse through, and some videos and et cetera to do that. There's a place there that if you'd like to have someone contact you directly, just let us know, and one of the members of the follow-up team will get in touch with you and see if we could answer all of your questions firsthand.
Great. And thanks again, Linda, for joining us. It was a really great conversation. Great to have you share all of your knowledge with us. For those of you who enjoyed this webinar, we'd love for you to join our next one. We actually have 2 webinars next week. The first is on August 14th. Fundly is going to join us. We're going to talk about peer-to-peer fundraising and crowdfunding. It should be really interesting. And the next day, we're actually going to be talking about nonprofit branding and social media. So if you visit our webinars page right there on our website, you can register for both of those. Totally free, totally educational. So we'll hope you join us again. And since it's right around the 2 o'clock hour, we'll end it there. So I'll say a final thanks to Linda. Linda, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
And Jay, thanks again. And thanks you to everyone else who joined us on the call today. Certainly appreciate you taking time out of your day. And have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.